In the quiet suburban town of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, life unfolded in a predictable rhythm. The streets were clean, the lawns perfectly manicured, and the neighbors greeted each other with friendly waves every morning. Among the residents were two couples whose lives had been intertwined for years, the Bradshaws and the Millers. Tim and Samantha Bradshaw seemed like the perfect couple. Tim, a 42-year-old software engineer, was successful in his career, providing a comfortable life for his family. Samantha, a stay-at-home mom, took care of their two children, juggling school pickups, extracurriculars, and the day-to-day tasks that kept their household running smoothly. She was known for her immaculate home, her cooking skills, and her ability to throw the best neighborhood parties. Next door lived Dave and Julia Miller. Dave, a construction manager, was known for his hands-on approach to life, always the one to fix things around the house or help a neighbor with a project. His wife, Julia, an art teacher at the local high school, was the creative one, always hosting art nights or working on her next masterpiece in their home studio. The Millers had been married for over a decade, just like the Bradshaws, and together the two couples were inseparable. Their children played together, and their families often spent weekends at each other's homes, celebrating birthdays, holidays, and casual dinners. But beneath the surface, all wasn't as idyllic as it appeared. Both marriages had begun to show signs of strain. Nothing dramatic, but subtle changes that chipped away at the foundation. Tim, though hard-working and a good provider, had grown distant. His long hours at work left little time for intimacy, and Samantha found herself longing for the man he used to be, the one who surprised her with flowers, took her out on spontaneous dates, and genuinely seemed interested in her thoughts. Now their conversations revolved around their kids, bills, and his job. Samantha felt lonely, even though she was surrounded by people. She tried to talk to Tim about it, but his response was always the same. "I'm just tired, Sam. We'll figure it out." Julia, on the other hand, had her own set of frustrations. Dave was still physically affectionate, but his attention had waned in other ways. He was no longer the adventurous, spontaneous man she had fallen in love with. Instead, he had settled into a routine, his excitement for life replaced by long hours at the construction site and weekends filled with household chores. Julia craved excitement, something that would break the monotony of their lives. One summer evening, after a neighborhood barbecue at the Bradshaws' house, Samantha and Julia sat on the back porch, sipping wine. The kids were playing in the yard, and their husbands were engrossed in a conversation about work. The two women found themselves talking about their marriages, something they rarely did. "I don't know, Jules," Samantha said, swirling the wine in her glass. "Sometimes I feel like Tim doesn't see me anymore. I'm just there." Julia nodded, her eyes scanning the darkening sky. "I know what you mean. Dave's a good guy, but sometimes I wonder if this is it. Is this what life is supposed to feel like? Just routine?" They sat in silence for a moment before Samantha spoke again. "Do you ever think about changing things up?" Julia raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "I don't know," Samantha replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Something different. Something exciting. I read about this thing once, about couples who swap partners, just for fun." Julia laughed, nearly spilling her wine. "Wife swap? You've got to be kidding me." "I'm serious," Samantha said, though she was smiling too. "I mean, not forever, but just to break the monotony. It could be fun, right?" Julia's laughter faded as she considered the idea. It was ridiculous, of course. But as the night wore on and the wine flowed, the idea didn't seem so outrageous. Both women were in a rut, and the thought of something new, something thrilling, began to take hold. By the time the evening ended, the idea of a wife swap had gone from a passing joke to a real possibility. They hadn't brought it up to their husbands yet, but it was clear from their conversation that they were both intrigued by the idea. The next week, Samantha and Tim were sitting on the couch after putting the kids to bed when she brought it up. Tim, ever practical, looked at her like she had suggested they move to Mars. A wife swap? You're joking, right? Samantha shook her head. Not really. I mean, think about it. We've been together for so long and things have gotten stale. Don't you think it could be fun, just for a weekend? Tim stared at her, then let out a low whistle. I don't know, Sam. That sounds dangerous. I know it's out there, Samantha said quickly, but I trust you. And we know Dave and Julia. It's not like it would be with strangers. We've known them for years. Tim mulled it over, running a hand through his hair. You're serious about this? I just want to feel something again, Samantha admitted, her voice soft. I'm not saying this is the solution to all our problems, but maybe it's worth trying. Tim sighed, leaning back against the couch. I guess I'll talk to Dave. Across the street, Julia was having a similar conversation with Dave. At first, he dismissed the idea, but the more they talked about it, the more curious he became. The thought of being with Samantha, even temporarily, stirred something in him he hadn't felt in a long time. Before long, the Millers were on board too. The plan was simple. They would all go away for a weekend at a cabin the Millers owned in the Poconos. The idea was to keep things light, just a way to escape the daily grind and explore something new. They agreed to no strings, no jealousy, just a weekend of fun. The anticipation leading up to the weekend was electric. Both couples felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. For Samantha, it was a way to break free from the monotony that had taken over her marriage. For Julia, it was a chance to feel alive again. But none of them could foresee the dangerous path they were about to walk. The weekend started off well enough. The cabin was isolated, nestled in the woods, far from the prying eyes of their small-town neighbors. They arrived on a Friday evening, unpacked, and settled into the cozy space. The atmosphere was light, almost playful, as they shared dinner and a few too many drinks. After dinner, the swap happened. Julia went with Tim and Samantha with Dave. It was strange at first, but the alcohol had loosened their inhibitions. What started as a fantasy quickly became reality, and for a few fleeting moments, it felt exciting, like they had broken out of the cages of their routine lives. But as the weekend wore on, something shifted. Dave became more possessive of Samantha, lingering too long when the couples regrouped for meals or drinks. His eyes followed her everywhere, and he began to make subtle comments that made her uncomfortable. Samantha tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just part of the weekend. But there was something unsettling about Dave's behavior. It wasn't just casual attraction. It was something deeper, darker. By Sunday morning, Samantha was ready to go home. The weekend had been fun, but she was eager to return to her normal life, her normal husband. But for Dave, the weekend had unlocked something he couldn't control. He had become obsessed with Samantha, convinced that their connection was more than just a fling. The ride home was tense, with Dave constantly glancing at Samantha in the rearview mirror. Julia and Tim, oblivious to the growing tension, chatted about the weekend as though it had been a fun little adventure. But for Samantha, the nightmare was just beginning. By the time Samantha returned to Lancaster, the unease from the weekend lingered like a dark cloud over her. Dave's obsessive behavior had unnerved her, but she tried to shake it off, telling herself that once they were back in their regular lives, things would go back to normal. She avoided his texts, hoping the silence would send a message. But Dave wasn't someone to let things go. His obsession grew stronger by the day. In his mind, Samantha wasn't just a fling. She was his. He became convinced that their brief encounter meant more than it did. As days passed, Dave's infatuation turned into something darker, more dangerous. He started showing up unannounced, finding excuses to come by the Bradshaws' house when Tim wasn't home. Samantha was polite but distant, hoping he would get the message. But Dave was relentless. One rainy evening, a week after the getaway, Samantha was alone at home. Tim was on a business trip, and the kids were staying with her parents for the night. She curled up on the couch, watching TV,
trying to distract herself from the unease that had settled in her chest. The sound of a car engine outside made her heart race. She glanced out the window and froze. Dave's truck was parked in the driveway.
Her phone buzzed almost immediately. "I need to see you, Sam. I can't stop thinking about you." Her stomach twisted with fear. She didn't respond, hoping he'd leave. But minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The pounding grew louder as she ignored it. She could hear Dave calling her name from the other side, his voice desperate, angry. Samantha's heart raced as she backed away from the door. She fumbled with her phone, trying to dial 911, but her hands were shaking too much. Before she could hit the call button, the door burst open with a crash, and there stood Dave, drenched from the rain, eyes wild with obsession. "What the hell are you doing, Dave? You need to leave," Samantha shouted, her voice trembling. He stepped inside, slamming the door behind him. "You can't just ignore me, Sam. We're supposed to be together. You felt it too, I know you did." "No, Dave, that weekend was a mistake," Samantha pleaded, backing further into the living room. "I'm with Tim, and I love him. You need to leave. Now." But Dave wasn't listening. His eyes darkened as he took another step toward her. "No, you're lying. You're mine now." Samantha's pulse quickened. She grabbed a fireplace poker from the hearth, holding it in front of her like a shield. "Stay back, Dave. I'm warning you." But Dave lunged at her, fueled by obsession and rage. Samantha swung the poker, connecting with his shoulder, but it barely slowed him down. He grabbed her by the wrist, twisting it until she dropped the weapon with a scream. Before she could react, Dave shoved her hard against the wall, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and ragged. "You're not leaving me, Sam. If I can't have you, no one will." Desperation filled Samantha as she struggled to break free. In the chaos, she kicked at Dave's knee, sending him stumbling back. She bolted for the kitchen, but before she could reach the door, Dave caught her by the hair, yanking her backward with such force that she crashed into the counter. Pain shot through her body as she hit the floor, gasping for breath. Dave loomed over her, grabbing the knife she had been preparing dinner with earlier. The blade gleamed in the dim light, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. "Dave, please, don't do this," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. But his eyes were cold, devoid of reason. In one swift motion, he plunged the knife into her chest. The pain was immediate and searing. Samantha's scream was cut short as blood gushed from the wound, soaking her shirt and pooling on the floor. Dave stabbed her again and again, each thrust more vicious than the last, until her body went limp beneath him. Panting, Dave stood over her lifeless body, his hands and clothes drenched in blood. The reality of what he had done slowly began to sink in. He dropped the knife with a clatter, stumbling back, staring in horror at the scene before him. Samantha was dead. For a few moments, there was only silence. The sound of the rain pounding against the windows, the ticking of the clock on the wall, everything felt surreal. Dave's heart raced as panic set in. What had he done? He had to get out of there. His mind raced as he grabbed a towel from the counter, wiping the blood from his hands, but no matter how much he scrubbed, it wouldn't come off. Frantic, he searched the room for a way to cover his tracks, but the blood was everywhere. On the floor, the walls, on his own skin. There was no way to clean this up, no way to make it go away. In a daze, Dave stumbled out the door, leaving Samantha's lifeless body behind him. The rain washed away the blood on his hands, but nothing could erase the memory of what he had done. As he drove away from the house, his mind raced, already concocting lies, excuses, anything to make this nightmare disappear. But it was too late. Samantha was gone, and Dave's life would never be the same. The aftermath of Samantha's brutal murder sent shockwaves through the quiet town of Lancaster. Tim returned home from his business trip to find his life shattered, the love of his life gone forever. Dave was arrested within hours, his blood-stained clothes and erratic behavior sealing his fate. The once close-knit neighborhood could never recover from the horrifying crime. Julia, devastated by her husband's actions, filed for divorce and moved away, unable to face the memories that haunted her. For Tim, life became a series of hollow routines, trying to care for their children while grappling with unimaginable grief. He never forgave himself for agreeing to that fateful weekend, a decision that unraveled everything. The Bradshaw house remained empty for years, a haunting reminder of the day fantasy turned to obsession and murder. In time, Lancaster moved on, but the tragic story of Samantha Bradshaw would forever remain etched in the town's dark history.